January 1st, 2006, began the way countless New Year's mornings begin across America. The celebrations of the previous night had finally quieted. Fireworks had faded into memory. Empty streets reflected the pale light of dawn. And most families were still asleep, recovering from the excitement of welcoming another year. In Richmond, Virginia, the city seemed unusually peaceful. The holiday had given residents a brief pause from ordinary routines, replacing the sound of traffic with an almost comforting silence. In neighborhoods throughout the city, people looked forward to spending the first day of the year with friends, relatives, and loved ones. Woodland Heights, one of Richmond's established residential neighborhoods, embodied that sense of calm. Tree-lined streets, historic homes, and neighbors who had known one another for years gave the area a reputation for safety. It was the kind of neighborhood where trust had become second nature. Some residents admitted they occasionally forgot to lock their doors during the day. Others left bicycles on front porches or allowed children to play outside without constant supervision. It was not because they ignored the possibility of crime, but because serious violence seemed so distant from everyday life that few imagined it could ever arrive without warning. Among the families enjoying that peaceful community were Brian and Catherine Harvey and their two daughters, Stella and Ruby. To those who knew them, they represented an ordinary, loving family living an ordinary life. Brian was recognized by many in Richmond for his years as a musician with the alternative rock band House of Freaks. Catherine was known for her kindness and her involvement with her community. Their daughters were still young enough to see the beginning of a new year as something filled with excitement and possibility rather than reflection. Like countless other families, they had plans for the day ahead. Friends expected to visit. Conversations would likely revolve around holiday memories, resolutions, and hopes for the months to come. Nothing suggested that the Harvey family would never see another evening together. Sometime during the morning, however, something went terribly wrong inside their home. The details would not become immediately apparent. To the outside world, there was little indication that anything unusual had happened. There were no neighbors reporting screams in the night. There was no frantic emergency call from inside the house. Instead, the first sign that something was wrong came from something deceptively ordinary: smoke. A friend of Brian Harvey arrived at the house as planned. Instead of being greeted by familiar faces, he noticed smoke rising from the residence. At first glance, it may have appeared to be an accidental house fire. An unfortunate way to begin a new year, but hardly unimaginable during the winter months. Still, the sight was troubling enough to prompt an immediate call to emergency services. Firefighters responded believing they were heading toward a routine fire. Such calls were not uncommon. Their objective was straightforward: control the blaze, protect nearby homes, and search for anyone who might still be inside. Yet within minutes of entering the house, the nature of the emergency changed completely. As firefighters searched through the smoke-filled structure, they located human remains. What they discovered was inconsistent with an accidental fire. The evidence before them suggested something far more disturbing. Recognizing signs that pointed toward criminal violence rather than a tragic accident, they immediately contacted law enforcement. What had begun as a fire investigation rapidly transformed into a homicide investigation. Police officers arriving at the scene quickly realized they were confronting one of the most devastating crime scenes Richmond had experienced in years. Eventually, investigators found all four members of the Harvey family in the basement of their home: Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, 9-year-old Stella, 4-year-old Ruby. None had survived. The shock spread rapidly through Woodland Heights. News traveled quickly among neighbors who had spent years believing they lived in one of the city's safest communities. The idea that an entire family had been murdered inside their own home seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Questions emerged immediately. Why this family? Had they been specifically targeted? Did they know their attackers? Was this a personal dispute that had escalated beyond imagination? Or had something even more random occurred? At first, investigators had very few answers. The fire had complicated the scene, damaging potential evidence. The Harvey family was not known to have significant personal conflicts or dangerous associates. Friends described them as generous, approachable, and deeply devoted to one another. Detectives found no obvious explanation for why someone would commit such an extraordinary act of violence against them. As investigators carefully examined the house, another troubling realization began to emerge. Certain valuables appeared to be missing. Cash, jewelry, electronics, ATM cards, and other personal property had been taken. The possibility that robbery had played a role became increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet even if robbery had been the initial motive, it did not explain the extraordinary brutality that followed. The property stolen from the home represented relatively modest financial value. Nothing investigators found suggested the offenders had obtained anything that could justify, in practical terms, the destruction of an entire family. That imbalance between motive and violence would become one of the defining features of the case. It forced detectives to consider whether they were looking at an isolated robbery gone horribly wrong or something far more dangerous. In the days ahead, Richmond police would discover that the Harvey family tragedy was not an isolated incident. Instead, it marked the beginning of a violent series of crimes that would leave additional victims dead before the perpetrators were finally identified. The investigation would grow beyond a single neighborhood and become one of the most significant homicide inquiries in the city's modern history. Every new piece of evidence would slowly connect separate crimes into one horrifying sequence. Every discovery would reveal that what happened inside the Harvey home was only the first chapter of a larger nightmare unfolding across Richmond during the first week of 2006. Yet before detectives could understand how those events were connected, they first had to understand the people whose lives had been taken inside that quiet house in Woodland Heights. Behind every photograph released to the public, behind every headline announcing another development in the investigation, was a family remembered not for the violence that ended their lives, but for the ordinary happiness that had defined them long before New Year's Day arrived. To understand why this case continues to resonate decades later, it is necessary to begin not with the offenders but with Brian, Catherine, Stella, and Ruby Harvey, the four people whose lives transformed an ordinary house fire investigation into one of Virginia's most heartbreaking true crime cases. Before investigators reconstructed timelines, examined evidence, or identified suspects, there was a family whose lives had unfolded in remarkably ordinary ways. Long before their names appeared in newspapers across Virginia, Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, Stella Harvey, and Ruby Harvey were simply a husband, a wife, and two daughters living in a neighborhood they believed was safe. Their story was not defined by violence. It was defined by music, family routines, community, and the quiet moments that rarely make headlines but form the foundation of everyday life. Those ordinary details would later become painfully significant because they illustrated just how completely unexpected the tragedy had been. Brian Harvey was 49 years old when he died. In Richmond, he was perhaps best known for his work as a musician. Years earlier, he had co-founded the alternative rock band House of Freaks, a group that earned recognition during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Although the band never became a mainstream commercial phenomenon, it developed a loyal following and earned respect among fans of alternative music. Brian's contributions as a songwriter and performer made him a familiar figure within Richmond's music community. Even after the band ended its original run, music remained an important part of his life. He continued writing, performing, and participating in the city's independent music scene. Friends described him as someone whose passion for music never overshadowed his commitment to his family. His artistic career was only one aspect of who he was. Those closest to him consistently remembered his calm personality, thoughtful nature, and kindness toward others. The image that emerged from those who knew Brian was not that of a celebrity, but of a man who found satisfaction in simple things: his work, his home, and the people he loved. Catherine Harvey, 39 years old, shared that same sense of stability. She worked in retail, but those who knew her often spoke less about her profession than about the way she interacted with people. She was described as friendly, approachable, and actively involved in community life. Whether participating in school-related activities or maintaining friendships within the neighborhood, Catherine built relationships that reflected warmth rather than conflict. Investigators would later discover no evidence suggesting that she had ongoing disputes or enemies. Friends consistently portrayed her as someone who valued family above everything else. Together, Brian and Catherine created a household centered on their two daughters. Stella Harvey, 9 years old, was beginning to develop her own interests and personality. According to those who remembered her, she enjoyed reading and shared an interest in music, a passion perhaps naturally encouraged by her father's background. At 9 years old, childhood is often marked by curiosity and imagination. School becomes a place not only for learning, but also for friendships, dreams, and discovering individual talents. Stella stood at that stage of life where each year brings noticeable changes, each birthday marking another step toward growing independence. Ruby Harvey, only 4 years old, was the youngest member of the family. Neighbors remembered her as cheerful, energetic, and full of life. At 4, the world remains wonderfully uncomplicated. Days revolve around family, play, and the comforting routine created by parents and older siblings. Ruby was still young enough that much of her understanding of safety came from the presence of the people around her. Home represented security, and her family represented the center of her world. Looking back through the available facts, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case is how ordinary the Harvey family's daily life appeared. There were no indications that they believed they were facing danger. No reports suggested they had received threats or experienced harassment. Investigators found no evidence that they were anticipating conflict with anyone. Instead, every available description pointed toward a family living peacefully in a community that shared their expectation of safety. Their home stood in Woodland Heights, a neighborhood known throughout Richmond for its historic character and quiet residential streets. Mature trees lined the roads. Older houses reflected decades of local history, and neighbors often recognized one another by name. It was not a place commonly associated with violent crime. In fact, the neighborhood's reputation contributed to habits that would later become an important part of the investigation. Residents sometimes left doors unlocked during the day because serious home invasions seemed highly unlikely. Trust had become part of everyday life. That trust was built over years of relatively peaceful living rather than carelessness. Investigators later concluded that on the morning of January 1st, Brian Harvey likely stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper. They believe the front door may have remained unlocked or slightly open afterward. If that conclusion was correct, it meant the opportunity presented itself by chance rather than through careful planning by the offenders. There was no evidence that the Harvey family had been specifically selected because of personal relationships or previous interactions. Instead, the available evidence pointed toward a random encounter made possible by circumstance. This detail would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire investigation. The Harvey family appeared to have done nothing that would normally place them at risk. They were not involved in criminal activity. They were not known to possess extraordinary wealth. They were not engaged in public disputes. Their lives reflected the ordinary routines shared by thousands of American families every day. Yet those very routines placed them in the path of two offenders searching for an opportunity. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile that reality with the family they had known. For many within the Richmond community, Brian and Catherine represented the kind of parents others admired. They balanced careers, family responsibilities, and personal interests while raising two young daughters in what appeared to be a stable and loving environment. The tragedy therefore extended beyond the immediate loss of 4 lives. It challenged deeply held assumptions about safety within the community itself. If something so devastating could happen to a family like the Harveys, people naturally questioned whether anyone could truly consider themselves beyond danger. As investigators began examining the crime scene, they also examined the family's background in search of possible explanations. Detectives routinely consider personal relationships, financial disputes, workplace conflicts, and previous threats when investigating homicide cases. In the Harvey family's case, those efforts produced little that suggested a motive based on personal animosity. Friends described the family positively. No obvious enemies emerged. Nothing indicated they had been specifically targeted because of who they were. That absence of an identifiable personal motive initially complicated the investigation. If investigators could not connect the victims to the offenders through relationships, they would need to rely entirely upon physical evidence, witness statements, and the sequence of events surrounding the crime. At the same time, understanding the Harvey family remained essential because it established what had been taken. This was not simply a homicide investigation measured by forensic reports and court documents. It involved 4 individual lives, each with their own routines, relationships, and future plans that ended without warning on the first morning of a new year. As detectives continued their work, they would eventually conclude that the people responsible had entered the house not because of who lived there, but because they saw an opportunity. The realization that the victims had likely been chosen at random only deepened the sense of loss felt throughout Richmond. The Harvey family had become victims not because of decisions they made or conflicts they created, but because they happened to be home when 2 offenders searching for money discovered what appeared to be an easy target. Understanding that painful truth is essential before examining the events that unfolded on New Year's morning, when an ordinary family, living an ordinary life, encountered 2 men whose search for property would become one of the most shocking crimes in Virginia's modern history. As investigators worked to understand why the Harvey family had become victims, another part of the story gradually came into focus. The evidence pointed away from a personal dispute and toward something far more unpredictable. The people responsible had no known relationship with Brian or Catherine Harvey. They were not neighbors with long-standing grievances, former acquaintances seeking revenge, or individuals connected to the family's personal or professional lives. Instead, the investigation would reveal that the tragedy began with 2 men moving through Richmond in search of an opportunity. Their names were Ricky Javon Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge. Understanding who they were is important, not because their lives deserve admiration or fascination, but because the circumstances surrounding their actions help explain how an ordinary robbery escalated into one of Virginia's most devastating family murders. Ricky Javon Gray was born in 1977 in Virginia. By the beginning of 2006, his life had already been shaped by years of criminal behavior. According to the available records summarized in this case, Gray had accumulated previous arrests involving theft, robbery, and other offenses. His background reflected repeated involvement with the criminal justice system rather than isolated mistakes. Investigators also learned that Gray struggled with cocaine addiction and the abuse of other drugs, problems that had contributed to instability in both his personal life and his criminal conduct. Drug addiction alone does not explain violent crime, nor does it predetermine a person's future actions. Millions of people struggle with addiction without harming others. In Gray's case, however, substance abuse existed alongside an extensive history of criminal activity, creating a pattern that investigators considered highly relevant when reconstructing the events of early January 2006. Before returning to Richmond, Gray had been living in Philadelphia. During that period, he married and attempted to build a family life. Yet according to the information available from the investigation, his circumstances continued to deteriorate. His addiction deepened, financial pressures increased, and his criminal behavior persisted. By the end of 2005, Gray had become wanted in Pennsylvania in connection with another homicide investigation. Rather than remaining there, he returned to Richmond with his family during the final weeks of the year. That move would place him in the city where the Harvey family lived, setting the stage for the crimes that followed. Gray did not act alone. Accompanying him was Ray Joseph Dandridge, a younger man who was related to Gray through marriage. Dandridge was the nephew of Gray's wife. Although younger than Gray, he also had a criminal background that included theft and robbery offenses. During the investigation and later court proceedings, authorities concluded that Dandridge participated as Gray's accomplice throughout the crimes committed in Richmond. At the same time, the available evidence consistently identified Gray as the dominant figure. According to statements and findings presented during the investigation, Gray made the critical decisions that shaped the course of events, while Dandridge followed his lead. This distinction would later influence how prosecutors approached the cases against each man. But in the days leading up to the Harvey murders, both were traveling together through Richmond searching for opportunities to steal. Investigators eventually reconstructed a general picture of what happened during New Year's Eve and the early hours of January 1st, 2006. Richmond, like countless American cities, was celebrating the arrival of a new year. Restaurants, bars, private homes, and public gathering places had been filled with people marking the transition from 2005 to 2006. As midnight passed and celebrations gradually ended, many residents returned home, believing the city was settling into a peaceful holiday morning. While families slept or rested after the festivities, Gray and Dandridge spent their time driving through Richmond. According to the investigation, they had been using drugs and were actively searching for houses that appeared vulnerable to burglary or robbery. Their objective, as later reflected in the evidence and Gray's own confession, was to obtain money and valuables. At that point, investigators found no indication that they were searching specifically for the Harvey family. This conclusion became one of the defining aspects of the case. Unlike many homicide investigations, where detectives begin by examining relationships between victims and offenders, the Harvey murders presented no such connection. Brian and Catherine Harvey did not know Gray or Dandridge. There was no evidence of previous meetings, disputes, business dealings, or personal associations. The offenders had not been stalking the family, and investigators uncovered no indication that the Harveys had been selected because of anything unique about them. Instead, everything suggested that the offenders were simply looking for an accessible target. This randomness made the crime particularly unsettling for the community. It challenged the common belief that violent crime usually arises from personal conflict or long-standing disputes. Here, investigators were faced with the possibility that an ordinary family had become victims simply because their home presented an opportunity at the wrong moment. As detectives analyzed Gray's later confession alongside the physical evidence collected from the scene, they concluded that robbery had indeed been the initial motive. Gray admitted that he entered the Harvey home intending to steal property. The items eventually taken, including cash, jewelry, electronics, ATM cards, vehicle keys, and other valuables supported that conclusion. Yet robbery alone could not explain what happened afterward. The financial value of the stolen property was relatively modest. Nothing suggested the offenders discovered extraordinary wealth or encountered unexpected resistance that fundamentally altered their plans. Instead, according to Gray's own statements, a deliberate decision was made after the robbery to eliminate every witness inside the house. That decision transformed what began as a property crime into a multiple homicide. Investigators viewed this transition as a critical turning point in understanding Gray's actions. Rather than fleeing after obtaining valuables, he chose to ensure that no one remained alive who could later identify him. This explanation was consistent with the available forensic evidence and ultimately became central to the prosecution's case. Dandridge's role remained significant throughout the investigation. Although Gray emerged as the principal decision-maker, Dandridge participated in the robbery and remained present during the crimes. Later statements indicated that Gray exercised greater control over events, but investigators concluded that both men bore criminal responsibility for what occurred inside the Harvey residence. As prosecutors prepared their cases, they would carefully examine the extent of each man's participation while recognizing that the crimes had been committed together. Looking back, the movements of Gray and Dandridge during the early hours of New Year's Day illustrate how quickly ordinary circumstances can intersect with criminal intent. The Harvey family had no reason to expect danger inside their own home. At nearly the same moment, two offenders were moving through the city searching for nothing more specific than a vulnerable house containing valuables they could steal. The investigation would later suggest that one small circumstance, the belief that the front door had been left unlocked or slightly open after Brian Harvey retrieved the morning newspaper, provided exactly the opportunity they had been seeking. Whether that single detail alone determined the family's fate can never be known with complete certainty. What investigators could establish, however, was that no evidence pointed toward careful planning against the Harvey family themselves. The victims were, by every indication, chosen because of circumstance rather than identity. That conclusion would become one of the most haunting realities of the entire case. As New Year's morning continued and the city slowly awakened, Gray and Dandridge found the opportunity they had been searching for. Within minutes of entering the quiet house on Woodland Heights, an intended robbery began to unfold. Before the morning was over, for innocent people would be dead. A home would be set on fire in an attempt to destroy the evidence, and Richmond would unknowingly become the starting point of a violent crime spree that investigators had not yet begun to understand. The morning of January 1st, 2006, began like countless other mornings for the Harvey family. The celebrations of New Year's Eve had ended, and the neighborhood of Woodland Heights remained quiet beneath the cold winter sky. Most residents were still inside their homes, enjoying the first peaceful hours of a new year. There was nothing unusual about the Harvey residence. No signs suggested that danger was approaching. No evidence indicated that the family anticipated what would happen next. Investigators would later conclude that the chain of events leading to one of Richmond's most shocking crimes may have begun with a simple, everyday routine. Brian Harvey stepped outside to retrieve the morning newspaper. According to investigators, it was during this ordinary task that the front door was likely left unlocked or slightly ajar. Whether the door remained open for only a few moments or somewhat longer could never be determined with certainty, but detectives believe that this seemingly insignificant circumstance created the opportunity Ricky Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge had been searching for. As the two men drove through Richmond looking for a house to rob, they noticed what appeared to be an accessible home. There was no evidence that they knew who lived there or had selected the residence in advance. Instead, everything uncovered during the investigation pointed toward a crime of opportunity. The unlocked or partially open door removed one of the barriers that often discourages burglars or robbers. Rather than forcing entry and risking attention from neighbors, Gray and Dandridge simply entered the house. At that moment, the Harvey family had unknowingly become the target of two strangers. Brian Harvey was the first person confronted. The available evidence indicates that he was quickly overpowered before he had any meaningful chance to summon help or escape. The attack unfolded inside the family's own home, a place that had always represented security. Detectives found no indication that Brian recognized either intruder or understood why they had entered. The confrontation happened rapidly, leaving little opportunity for resistance beyond the instinctive effort to protect himself and his family. Shortly afterward, Catherine Harvey was also confronted and forced under the control of the intruders. The sounds of movement inside the house eventually awakened Stella and Ruby. What should have been the beginning of a holiday morning became a terrifying situation that neither child could possibly have understood. Investigators later determined that all four members of the family were gathered under the control of the offenders. The evidence showed that Gray and Dandridge did not immediately carry out the killings. Instead, they restrained the family while searching the house for valuables. According to court records and investigative findings, the offenders used electrical cords, tape, and other materials available inside the home to bind the victims. Their hands, feet, and mouths were secured, preventing them from calling for help or attempting to escape. One by one, the family members were moved into the basement. This movement was significant because it suggested that the offenders wanted to isolate the victims. While they searched the rest of the house, investigators also noted evidence indicating that at least some members of the family struggled against their restraints during the ordeal. Although the exact sequence of every movement inside the home could never be reconstructed with absolute precision, the physical evidence demonstrated that the victims had not surrendered without resistance. These findings underscored the desperate circumstances unfolding beneath the quiet appearance of the neighborhood outside. While the Harvey family remained restrained in the basement, Gray searched the residence. According to the investigation, his focus remained on locating anything of financial value. The offenders demanded cash, jewelry, ATM cards, vehicle keys, and other property. They also required the family to provide information that would allow them to use the stolen ATM cards later, including personal identification numbers. Throughout the search, Gray and Dandridge moved from room to room collecting items they believed could be sold or converted into cash. Among the property eventually determined to have been stolen were money, electronic equipment, a laptop computer, jewelry, Catherine Harvey's wedding ring, vehicle keys, and various other valuables found throughout the home. When investigators later reviewed the inventory of stolen property, one conclusion stood out immediately. The overall financial value of the items was relatively modest. There was no hidden fortune inside the Harvey residence, no expensive collection, and no evidence that the offenders unexpectedly discovered significant wealth. Instead, they left with ordinary household valuables that could be found in many homes across the country. This fact became important because it highlighted the enormous disparity between the original motive and the violence that followed. Detectives concluded that robbery had almost certainly been the initial objective. The physical evidence supported that assessment, and Gray himself would later admit that the purpose of entering the house had been to steal. Yet as the investigation progressed, it became equally clear that something changed after the robbery had largely been completed. Rather than leaving with the stolen property, Gray reached a decision that fundamentally altered the course of events. According to his later confession, he decided that no witnesses could be allowed to survive. The Harvey family had seen the faces of the men inside their home. Even if the robbery itself had succeeded, the possibility that the victims could later identify the offenders represented a risk Gray was unwilling to accept. Investigators determined that this decision marked the transition from robbery to intentional multiple homicide. The importance of that conclusion extended far beyond understanding motive. It explained why the level of violence bore no relationship to the value of the stolen property. Financial gain alone could not account for what happened next. Instead, prosecutors argued successfully that the murders were committed to eliminate witnesses who could identify the offenders. During the later court proceedings, Gray's confession aligned with the forensic evidence recovered from the house, reinforcing investigators' reconstruction of the events. Although every minute inside the Harvey residence could not be recreated with complete certainty, the available evidence established a clear sequence. The offenders entered seeking valuables. They restrained the family to maintain control while searching the home. They collected property and financial information. Then, after completing the robbery, Gray made the decision that none of the victims would be left alive. The realization that the murders were not an unavoidable consequence of resistance, but rather a deliberate effort to remove witnesses became one of the defining features of the prosecution's case. For investigators, this distinction carried enormous significance because it demonstrated planning and intent beyond the original robbery itself. Outside the Harvey residence, however, none of these events were visible. Woodland Heights remained quiet. Neighbors continued enjoying the first morning of the new year, unaware that only a short distance away, an entire family was being held captive inside their own home. The absence of obvious disturbance reflected how quickly the offenders had gained control and how effectively the victims had been isolated from anyone who might have intervened. The neighborhood's reputation for peace and safety, which had encouraged residents to trust their surroundings for so many years, also meant that nothing immediately drew attention to the house. As the robbery came to an end, Gray's decision to eliminate every witness set in motion the most devastating phase of the crime. What had begun as an opportunistic search for money and valuables was about to become one of the most tragic family murders in Virginia's modern history. The basement of the Harvey home, where the family had been restrained while the house was searched above them, would become the scene where the robbery ended and a far more horrific crime began. In the hours ahead, the offenders would make one final attempt to erase what had happened by setting fire to the house, believing the flames might destroy the evidence they left behind. Instead, the fire would fail to accomplish its purpose, preserving enough evidence for investigators to begin uncovering the truth behind the events of that New Year's morning. By the time Ricky Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge had finished searching the Harvey residence, the original purpose of the crime had already been accomplished. They had collected cash, jewelry, electronic equipment, ATM cards, vehicle keys, and other valuables that could later be used or sold. Investigators would eventually determine that the total value of the stolen property was relatively modest, especially when compared with the extraordinary violence that followed. Nothing discovered during the investigation suggested that the offenders had unexpectedly found significant wealth inside the home. Instead, they had taken ordinary possessions belonging to an ordinary family. At that moment, the offenders still had the opportunity to leave. Had they walked out of the house after the robbery, the case would likely have remained a serious property crime accompanied by kidnapping and assault. Instead, according to Ricky Gray's own confession and the conclusions reached through forensic examination, a deliberate decision was made that transformed the crime forever. Gray later admitted that he decided the Harvey family could not be left alive because they had seen the faces of the men who entered their home. The robbery was no longer the only concern. Preventing future identification became his priority. That explanation, repeated throughout the investigation and later presented during court proceedings, matched the physical evidence recovered from the scene. Prosecutors argued that the killings were not the result of panic or an unexpected confrontation. Rather, they represented a conscious decision to eliminate every potential witness. This conclusion would become one of the most significant elements supporting the charges brought against Gray. Down in the basement, Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, 9-year-old Stella, and 4-year-old Ruby remained restrained. The evidence established that they had been bound using electrical cords, tape, and other materials found inside their own home. The basement, initially used to isolate the family while the robbery took place, became the location where the offenders carried out the final stage of their plan. The official investigative records and court documents contained detailed descriptions of the injuries sustained by each victim. Those findings were essential in establishing the facts presented during the trial. However, the level of violence described in those documents is deeply disturbing, particularly because 2 of the victims were children. It is enough to say that forensic evidence confirmed the victims suffered fatal attacks while still restrained, demonstrating that they had little or no opportunity to defend themselves once Gray decided to eliminate the witnesses. Medical evidence also showed that multiple methods of violence were used during the attacks. Those findings were consistent with Gray's confession and supported investigators' reconstruction of the sequence of events inside the basement. For prosecutors, the condition in which the victims were found illustrated both the calculated nature of the crime and the complete absence of mercy shown toward any member of the family. The fact that Brian and Catherine died alongside their daughters made the case especially devastating for investigators, emergency responders, and the Richmond community. Cases involving multiple victims are always difficult, but crimes affecting entire families often leave a particularly lasting impact because they erase multiple generations at once. Here, a husband, wife, and two young daughters all lost their lives within the same home that had represented safety only hours earlier. Once the killings were complete, Gray and Dandridge turned their attention toward the final problem they believed remained: the crime scene itself. Investigators later concluded that Gray attempted to destroy evidence before leaving the house. According to the investigation, alcohol found inside the residence was poured onto an easel and other combustible materials located in the basement. The intention was straightforward. If the fire spread throughout the structure, it could consume physical evidence, complicate forensic analysis, and potentially prevent investigators from determining exactly what had happened inside the home. After setting the fire, the offenders left the residence with the stolen property. From their perspective, the flames would likely finish what they had started. Fire has long presented investigators with unique challenges. Heat can destroy fingerprints, damage biological evidence, alter bloodstain patterns, and collapse structural elements that might otherwise preserve important clues. Whether Gray fully understood the science behind fire investigations is unknown, but the available evidence indicates that he believed arson would reduce the likelihood of being identified. In reality, events unfolded differently. Although the fire did ignite, it failed to spread through the house in the way the offenders apparently intended. The blaze remained limited instead of consuming the entire structure. While portions of the residence sustained damage, much of the house survived. Even more importantly for investigators, critical forensic evidence remained intact. The incomplete destruction of the crime scene would later prove essential in reconstructing the sequence of events and supporting the prosecution's case. The offenders had attempted to erase the evidence, but they had not succeeded. As smoke slowly accumulated inside the house, it eventually became visible from outside. The fire was no longer hidden within the basement. Instead, faint signs of trouble began emerging above the roofline, although no one yet understood what those signs truly represented. Elsewhere in Richmond, New Year's Day continued. Families gathered for meals, watched football games, or visited friends after the previous night's celebrations. Woodland Heights itself remained remarkably quiet. The neighborhood had heard no reports of a violent confrontation. No one outside the Harvey residence knew that 4 people had already lost their lives inside the home. That silence would continue until someone arrived expecting an ordinary holiday visit. According to the investigation, a friend of Brian Harvey came to the house later that morning as planned. The visit had been arranged before the new year began, making the arrival seem completely routine. Instead of finding a family preparing to welcome guests, the visitor noticed smoke coming from the residence. The sight immediately raised concern. A house fire on a winter morning was serious enough by itself, regardless of its cause. Recognizing that something was wrong, the friend called 911 without delay. Emergency dispatchers treated the report as a structure fire. Firefighters responded expecting to battle flames and search for possible occupants trapped inside. Nothing in the initial emergency call suggested they were heading toward one of the most disturbing homicide scenes Richmond had experienced in decades. Upon arriving at the Harvey residence, firefighters began performing the duties they had trained for countless times before. Their first priority was controlling the fire and determining whether anyone remained inside the building. As they entered the smoke-filled house and searched the interior, they encountered human remains. Very quickly, experienced responders recognized that the circumstances were inconsistent with an accidental residential fire. The condition of the victims indicated that the deaths could not simply be explained by smoke, inhalation, or burns. Realizing they were facing something far more serious than an ordinary fire, Firefighters immediately notified law enforcement authorities. The response changed almost instantly. Fire investigators, homicide detectives, crime scene specialists, and additional officers converged on Woodland Heights. What had begun as a fire investigation was now unmistakably a multiple homicide investigation. As police secured the residence and examined the basement, they confirmed that Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, Stella Harvey, and Ruby Harvey had all died inside their own home. The fire had failed to conceal the truth. Instead, it preserved enough evidence to reveal that the Harvey family had not been victims of an accident, but of an intentional and carefully documented crime. Yet despite the significance of what investigators discovered, many questions remained unanswered. The identities of the offenders were still unknown. Their motive, beyond the apparent robbery, had not yet been fully established. Detectives did not know whether they had just solved the boundaries of the crime, or whether the people responsible were still moving freely through Richmond, prepared to strike again. Tragically, the answer to that question would emerge within days, as additional violent crimes began to reveal that the Harvey family murders were only the opening chapter of a far larger and even more alarming series of attacks. The discovery inside the Harvey residence immediately transformed what had begun as a routine fire response into one of the largest homicide investigations Richmond had faced in modern times. Once firefighters recognized that the deaths inside the house were inconsistent with an accidental fire, law enforcement assumed control of the scene. Detectives, crime scene investigators, forensic specialists, and fire investigators all arrived in Woodland Heights, each responsible for reconstructing a sequence of events that no surviving witness could describe. Their challenge was immense, for members of the same family had been killed inside their own home. Portions of the residence had been damaged by fire, and the offenders had already disappeared. The first priority was preserving every piece of evidence that had survived the attempted arson. Although the fire had caused damage, investigators quickly realized it had not consumed the entire structure. That fact proved crucial. Had the flames spread throughout the house, many forms of forensic evidence might have been permanently destroyed. Instead, enough remained for investigators to begin establishing what had happened during the early hours of January 1st. The basement became the central focus of the investigation. There, detectives documented the location of the victims, the restraints used to bind them, and the condition of the surrounding area. Every item was photographed, measured, and carefully collected according to forensic procedures. Investigators also examined the origin of the fire. Evidence supported the conclusion that the blaze had been intentionally set rather than caused by an electrical malfunction or household accident. The presence of alcohol poured onto an easel and other combustible materials was consistent with an attempt to destroy the crime scene after the killings had already taken place. This finding significantly influenced the direction of the investigation because it demonstrated an effort to conceal evidence rather than an accidental fire occurring during the robbery. As detectives expanded their examination beyond the basement, they began identifying signs that property had been taken from the house. Family members and friends helped investigators determine what appeared to be missing. Cash, jewelry, electronic devices, ATM cards, vehicle keys, and other valuables had disappeared. These observations supported the growing theory that robbery had been the offender's original objective. Yet investigators remained troubled by the extraordinary violence inflicted upon the victims. The financial value of the stolen property simply did not explain the complete destruction of an entire family. Detectives considered several possibilities during the early stages of the investigation. One possibility was that someone known to the Harvey family had committed the crime. Homicide investigations frequently begin by examining relatives, friends, co-workers, or individuals with documented conflicts involving the victims. Investigators carefully reviewed Brian and Catherine Harvey's personal and professional backgrounds. They searched for evidence of disputes, threats, financial conflicts, or personal relationships that might provide a motive. Those efforts produced little. Friends consistently described the Harvey family as kind, respected, and deeply involved in their community. Detectives found no indication that they had enemies capable of carrying out such a crime. The absence of an obvious personal motive gradually shifted attention toward another explanation. The missing valuables suggested that the offenders had entered the home intending to steal. If that theory proved correct, then the Harvey family may have been selected not because of who they were, but because their house appeared vulnerable at the wrong moment. This realization made the case even more unsettling. A random robbery escalating into multiple murders challenged assumptions about how such crimes usually unfolded. Still, investigators needed evidence rather than theories. They continued processing the crime scene, searching for fingerprints, biological evidence, and any trace capable of identifying those responsible. The attempted arson complicated that work. Heat and smoke had affected portions of the residence, and investigators acknowledged that some potential evidence had likely been lost forever. Even so, the fire had failed to erase everything. Detectives believed enough evidence remained to reconstruct the crime, provided they could identify suspects for comparison. At that stage, however, they had no names and no surviving eyewitnesses from inside the Harvey home. The investigation might have remained stalled far longer had events outside Woodland Heights not begun unfolding almost immediately. Instead of disappearing after the Harvey murders, the offenders continued committing crimes. This decision ultimately provided investigators with opportunities they otherwise would never have had. According to the investigative timeline, on January 3rd, only 2 days after the Harvey family was killed, Gray and Dandridge committed another robbery. Unlike the events inside the Harvey residence, this crime did not end with every victim dead. A surviving victim was able to provide investigators with descriptions of the offenders. For detectives working the Harvey investigation, this development became critically important. Until then, they had been attempting to identify unknown suspects using only physical evidence collected from the crime scene. Now they possessed descriptions of individuals believed to have committed a similar offense. Although investigators could not immediately conclude that the crimes were connected, the similarities warranted careful comparison. Detectives began examining whether the methods used during the separate incidents shared common characteristics. As evidence accumulated, the possibility that Richmond was facing a serial pattern of violent robberies became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Then, on January 6, the investigation expanded dramatically. Authorities discovered 3 additional homicide victims connected to the Baskerville, Tucker family. The murders occurred within the same week as the Harvey killings and displayed important similarities that immediately attracted investigators' attention. Detectives compared evidence from both crime scenes, looking for recurring patterns involving the offender's behavior, stolen property, and methods of operation. As these comparisons continued, separate investigations gradually converged into a single, much larger inquiry. Detectives recognized that they were no longer investigating one isolated family tragedy. They were confronting a violent crime spree involving multiple victims across Richmond. The connection between the cases strengthened as investigators analyzed witness statements, physical evidence, and information concerning stolen property. Details gathered from one crime scene helped explain evidence recovered from another. Witness descriptions from surviving victims became increasingly valuable because they offered investigators something the Harvey case alone could never provide: direct observations of the offenders while they were still alive. Those descriptions, combined with the growing body of forensic and investigative evidence, narrowed the search considerably. Law enforcement eventually identified Ricky Javon Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge as the principal suspects responsible for the series of crimes. Once authorities located and arrested the 2 men, investigators were finally able to compare the evidence collected from the Harvey residence with statements obtained during questioning. The investigation reached its most significant breakthrough when Ricky Gray admitted his role in the murders. During questioning, Gray acknowledged that the original purpose of entering the Harvey home had been robbery. He further admitted that after obtaining valuables, he decided to kill the family to prevent anyone from identifying him later. This confession aligned closely with what investigators had already concluded based on the physical evidence. The stolen property explained the robbery. The condition of the victims demonstrated that they had remained restrained. The attempted arson explained the effort to destroy evidence before leaving the scene. Gray's confession connected these separate pieces into a coherent sequence of events supported by forensic findings. Ray Joseph Dandridge also admitted participating in the robbery and acknowledged his involvement alongside Gray. Although the investigation consistently identified Gray as the individual directing the crimes and making the critical decisions, detectives compared both men's statements with the evidence recovered from the Harvey residence, ensuring that the confessions corresponded with independently established facts rather than relying solely upon admissions made during interrogation. By the conclusion of the investigation, authorities had reconstructed the essential sequence with considerable confidence. Two offenders searching for money entered a house that appeared accessible. They restrained an innocent family while stealing valuables. After completing the robbery, Ricky Gray decided that no witnesses could survive. The victims were murdered. The house was deliberately set on fire in an unsuccessful attempt to destroy evidence, and the offenders fled. Their decision to continue committing violent crimes in the days that followed ultimately provided investigators with the evidence necessary to identify them. What began as an investigation into a suspicious house fire had evolved into the unraveling of the 2006 Richmond spree murders. The Harvey family had been the first victims in a series of crimes that claimed 7 lives in less than a week. Although investigators had now identified those responsible and secured confessions that matched the available evidence, one final stage remained. The facts assembled through months of investigative work would soon be presented before a courtroom, where prosecutors would seek justice for Brian, Catherine, Stella, and Ruby Harvey, while determining how the legal system would respond to one of Virginia's most devastating acts of family violence. By the time the investigation reached its conclusion, detectives had transformed what initially appeared to be a devastating but mysterious house fire into one of the most thoroughly documented homicide cases in Richmond's modern history. Months of forensic work, witness interviews, recovered property, and the statements obtained from the two suspects had established a clear sequence of events. Prosecutors now faced the responsibility of presenting that evidence before the court, demonstrating not only who had committed the crimes, but also proving the intent behind every major decision made inside the Harvey home on January 1, 2006. The legal proceedings that followed were not simply about assigning blame. They were intended to provide accountability for the deaths of Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, 9-year-old Stella Harvey, and 4-year-old Ruby Harvey, while also addressing the broader series of crimes that had shaken the Richmond community during the first week of the new year. Ricky Javon Gray faced numerous serious criminal charges arising from the Harvey family murders. Prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated a robbery that deliberately escalated into multiple intentional killings. The physical evidence recovered from the Harvey residence formed the foundation of the case. Investigators had documented the condition of the victims, the restraints used during the crime, the items stolen from the home, and the evidence showing that the fire had been intentionally set after the murders. Each piece of evidence supported the prosecution's theory that the killings were not accidental consequences of a robbery, but calculated acts intended to eliminate witnesses. Gray's own confession became another central component of the case. During questioning, he admitted that robbery had been the original objective and acknowledged deciding to kill the family so that no one would later identify him. Importantly, prosecutors did not rely on the confession alone. They presented it alongside forensic findings that independently supported the sequence Gray described. This combination of physical evidence and admissions strengthened the prosecution's position considerably. Every significant aspect of the confession corresponded with facts already established through the investigation, giving jurors a consistent narrative supported by multiple sources rather than by a single statement. The prosecution also emphasized the random nature of the crime. Brian and Catherine Harvey had no known relationship with Gray or Ray Joseph Dandridge. There was no evidence of previous disputes, financial conflicts, or personal connections that might explain the attack. Instead, investigators concluded that the family had simply become victims of opportunity after their home appeared accessible to two men searching for valuables. This conclusion reinforced the prosecution's argument that the murders were committed solely to prevent identification after the robbery had already succeeded. During the trial, the court examined the events inside the Harvey residence in careful detail. Forensic experts explained how the available evidence allowed investigators to reconstruct the sequence of the crime despite the offender's attempt to destroy the scene by setting the house on fire. Fire investigators described why the blaze had not spread throughout the residence as intended, preserving critical evidence that ultimately helped establish the facts presented before the jury. Crime scene investigators discussed the significance of the restraints and the location where the victims were found, while other witnesses addressed the property taken from the home and the investigative steps that eventually connected the Harvey murders to the larger Richmond crime spree. Throughout the proceedings, the focus remained on demonstrating intent, planning, and responsibility. Prosecutors argued that Gray had opportunities to leave the house after completing the robbery, but instead chose to eliminate every witness inside. That deliberate decision distinguished the case from robberies in which violence occurs during sudden confrontations or acts of panic. According to the evidence presented, the killings occurred after the offenders had already obtained what they came to steal. The prosecution maintained that this sequence showed conscious decision-making rather than impulsive behavior. Ray Joseph Dandridge also faced prosecution for his participation in the crimes. However, his legal path differed significantly from Gray's. According to the information established during the investigation, Dandridge admitted participating in the robbery and acknowledged acting alongside Gray. At the same time, prosecutors consistently regarded Gray as the dominant participant who directed the critical decisions leading to the murders. As a result, Dandridge entered into a plea agreement with the Commonwealth. Under that agreement, he accepted responsibility for his role and cooperated with authorities. In exchange, prosecutors did not seek the death penalty against him. Instead, Dandridge received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The differing outcomes reflected the prosecution's assessment of each defendant's level of responsibility as supported by the available evidence. Ricky Gray's case proceeded differently. After considering the evidence presented during trial, the jury convicted him of multiple serious offenses, including capital murder charges arising from the deaths of Stella and Ruby Harvey. Those convictions carried the possibility of the death penalty under Virginia law. The jury ultimately imposed death sentences for the murders of the two children, while Gray also received life sentences for crimes associated with the deaths of Brian and Catherine Harvey. The verdict represented the legal system's conclusion that the murders involved aggravating circumstances warranting the most severe punishment available under state law at that time. Following conviction, Gray exercised the legal avenues available to every defendant sentenced to death. Over the following years, his case moved through the appellate process, where higher courts reviewed both the trial proceedings and the sentence imposed. Such reviews are standard in capital cases, providing opportunities to examine whether legal procedures were properly followed and whether constitutional protections were respected throughout the judicial process. Ultimately, however, the convictions and death sentence remained in effect. On January 18, 2017, more than 11 years after the murders of the Harvey family, Ricky Gray was executed by lethal injection in Virginia. His execution marked the legal conclusion of one of the state's most disturbing homicide cases. For many people connected to the investigation, It represented the final chapter in a process that had begun with a house fire on New Year's Day in 2006. Yet for the families and friends of the victims, no court ruling or sentence could restore what had been lost. Legal accountability can establish responsibility and impose punishment, but it cannot reverse the permanent consequences of violent crime. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors consistently reminded the court that the case was not merely about the actions of the offenders. It was about four innocent people whose lives ended inside a home where they should have been safest. Brian Harvey lost the opportunity to continue creating music and sharing his life with his family. Catherine Harvey lost the future she had been building with her husband and daughters. Stella and Ruby lost every possibility that childhood normally promises: education, adulthood, careers, families of their own, and decades of experiences that would never come to pass. The legal system could document these losses only through evidence, testimony, and verdicts. Yet their true significance extended far beyond courtroom records. The prosecution of Ricky Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge also carried broader importance for the Richmond community. The Harvey family murders had not been an isolated tragedy, but the opening act of the 2006 Richmond spree murders, which ultimately claimed 7 lives in less than a week. Successfully identifying, prosecuting, and convicting those responsible brought an end to a violent crime spree that had deeply unsettled the city. Even so, the conclusion of the trial did not erase the questions many residents continued asking in the years that followed. How could such extraordinary violence emerge so suddenly within a peaceful neighborhood? Why had an ordinary family become victims of a random opportunity? And how would Richmond remember those whose lives had been taken? Those questions extended beyond the courtroom, becoming part of the lasting legacy of the Harvey family murders and the community forever changed by them. The murder of the Harvey family was already one of the most devastating crimes Richmond, Virginia, had experienced in years. For people had been killed inside their own home, including 2 young children, and investigators were still working to understand how such violence could occur in a quiet neighborhood. But as detectives continued following the evidence, they discovered that the tragedy in Woodland Heights was not an isolated event. The Harvey family murders were only one part of a larger sequence of crimes that would become known as the 2006 Richmond spree murders. Within less than a week, 7 people would lose their lives, and the city would be forced to confront the reality that the offenders responsible for the Harvey killings had continued moving through Richmond after leaving that house behind. For investigators, this discovery changed the entire scale of the case. What had initially been a search for answers surrounding one family became a race to understand and stop a broader pattern of violence. The possibility that the same individuals were responsible for multiple crimes meant that every piece of evidence had greater importance. A detail that seemed insignificant in one investigation could become the missing connection in another. Detectives from different cases began comparing information, examining similarities in methods, and reviewing any evidence that could reveal whether the crimes were linked. The first major breakthrough came not from the Harvey residence itself, but from another crime committed after the murders. On January 3, 2006, only 2 days after Brian, Catherine, Stella, and Ruby Harvey were killed, Gray and Dandridge carried out another robbery. Unlike the Harvey case, this incident did not end with every victim dead. A survivor was able to provide information about the offenders, including descriptions that would later become extremely valuable to investigators. This was a turning point. Until then, the Harvey investigation had faced a major obstacle. There were no surviving witnesses inside the home who could identify the attackers. Detectives had been forced to rely on physical evidence, forensic analysis, and the reconstruction of events after the crime had already occurred. The existence of a surviving witness from a later robbery provided investigators with a completely different type of evidence. Instead of examining only what the offenders had left behind, authorities now had information from someone who had directly encountered them. Investigators carefully evaluated the similarities between the crimes. They considered the methods used, the type of property targeted, and the behavior of the offenders during each incident. While every crime scene had its own circumstances, certain patterns began emerging. The offenders appeared focused on obtaining money and valuables. Violence was used as a method of control. The crime showed an increasing level of danger, suggesting that the people responsible were willing to escalate their actions. As detectives connected these details, the possibility of a continuing threat became increasingly clear. Richmond authorities were no longer searching only for individuals connected to a single homicide. They were attempting to identify suspects believed responsible for a violent sequence of crimes occurring across the city. Then, on January 6th, the investigation expanded again when authorities discovered additional victims connected to the Baskerville, Tucker family. 3 more people had been killed as part of the same crime spree. The discovery was devastating for investigators who were already dealing with the Harvey case. It confirmed their fears that the violence had continued beyond Woodland Heights. The victims were not connected by personal relationships to the offenders. Instead, like the Harvey family, they had become targets in a series of crimes driven by robbery and followed by extreme violence. The connection between the Harvey murders and the Baskerville, Tucker killings became a critical step in building the overall case against Gray and Dandridge. Investigators compared evidence from the different scenes, searching for consistent elements that could establish a common source. Information about stolen property, witness accounts, and the circumstances surrounding each crime helped create a larger picture of the offender's movements and behavior. The investigation demonstrated the importance of cooperation between different law enforcement teams. Separate crimes that might initially appear unrelated could reveal their connection when examined together. In a case involving a spree offender, timing becomes especially important. The gap between crimes can be short, and every hour that passes may represent another opportunity for additional victims. The Harvey investigation was no longer only about solving a past crime. It was also about preventing future ones. As investigators assembled the evidence, attention increasingly focused on Ricky Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge. The information from the surviving victim, combined with evidence collected from the crime scenes, helped authorities identify the 2 men as suspects. Once Gray and Dandridge were located and taken into custody, investigators could finally begin comparing their statements with the evidence already collected. The arrest marked a significant moment for Richmond. After days of uncertainty, authorities had identified the individuals believed responsible for one of the city's most frightening crime sequences. However, the work was far from complete. Investigators still needed to prove exactly what had happened, determine each man's role, and build a case strong enough to withstand courtroom examination. The questioning of Gray became particularly important. During interviews with authorities, he admitted his involvement in the crimes. His statements provided investigators with information about how the offenses began and how they developed. Gray explained that the original intention behind entering the Harvey residence was robbery. According to his confession, the decision to kill the family came afterward, when he determined that allowing witnesses to survive would create a risk of identification. This admission closely matched the evidence already collected from the crime scene. Investigators had already concluded that robbery appeared to be the initial motive because valuable property was missing. They had also determined that the victims had been restrained and that the fire had been deliberately set after the killings. Gray's statement provided a direct explanation for these findings. It connected the physical evidence with the decisions made by the offenders. Dandridge's involvement was also examined carefully. Although he admitted participating in the robbery and acknowledged his role alongside Gray, investigators concluded that Gray had been the primary decision-maker. This distinction became central to the legal proceedings that followed. The investigation did not simply seek to determine whether both men had participated. It also examined the actions, choices, and responsibility of each individual. By the time investigators had connected the crimes, The full scope of the Richmond spree murders had become clear. 7 people had been killed in less than a week. A community that had begun 2006 celebrating a new year was suddenly forced to confront an extraordinary wave of violence. The Harvey family murders represented the beginning of that sequence. But the investigation revealed that the tragedy extended far beyond one home and one neighborhood. For Richmond residents, the crimes created a sense of fear and disbelief. The city had always contained the ordinary challenges of urban life. But this level of violence felt different. The victims were not connected by a common conflict or dangerous lifestyle. They were ordinary people whose lives intersected with 2 offenders searching for opportunities to steal. That randomness made the crimes especially difficult to understand. The investigation eventually brought answers, but those answers carried a painful reality. The Harvey family had not been targeted because of anything they had done. Their deaths were the result of a chance encounter with individuals willing to commit extreme violence in pursuit of limited financial gain. The successful identification of Gray and Dandridge provided relief to investigators and the community. But it also revealed the devastating extent of what had happened during those first days of 2006. What began with smoke rising from a home in Woodland Heights had uncovered a chain of crimes that forever changed Richmond's history. The next stage would be determining how the justice system would respond to the men responsible and how the city would remember the victims whose lives had been taken so suddenly. The arrest of Ricky Javon Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge marked a major turning point in the investigation into the Harvey family murders. But an arrest alone did not provide justice. Investigators still had the difficult task of proving exactly what happened inside the Harvey residence and establishing the responsibility of each suspect. In a case involving 4 victims, an attempted fire, multiple crime scenes, and a wider criminal spree, every piece of evidence had to be carefully examined and connected. The goal was not simply to identify the people responsible. It was to create a complete and accurate account of how a robbery at a quiet Richmond home became one of the most shocking family murders in Virginia's history. From the beginning, investigators understood that the physical evidence from the Harvey residence would be essential. The offenders had attempted to destroy the scene by setting a fire, but their effort had failed to erase the truth. The house remained damaged but not destroyed. This allowed forensic specialists to continue their examination and recover information that would later become central to the prosecution's case. Investigators documented the location of the victims, the restraints used during the crime, and the condition of the basement where the family had been held. Each discovery helped establish the sequence of events that occurred before emergency responders arrived. The evidence showed that the family had not simply died as a result of the fire. Instead, investigators determined that the victims had been killed before the attempt to burn the residence. This distinction was critical. It demonstrated that the fire was not the cause of the tragedy, but rather an additional criminal act intended to hide what had already occurred. The presence of intentionally placed combustible materials supported the conclusion that the offenders had attempted to destroy evidence after the murders. Investigators also examined the missing property from the Harvey home. The absence of certain items helped confirm the robbery motive. Cash, electronic devices, jewelry, ATM cards, vehicle keys, and other valuables had been taken. These findings matched the theory that Gray and Dandridge entered the residence intending to steal. However, the property recovered during the investigation also revealed something important about the crime. The violence had not been committed because the offenders had discovered something valuable enough to justify extreme actions. The amount of property taken did not explain the loss of 4 lives. Instead, investigators concluded that the murders occurred because the offenders wanted to prevent the victims from identifying them. This explanation became even stronger after authorities obtained statements from Gray. During questioning, Gray admitted his involvement in the crimes. He acknowledged that the original purpose of entering the Harvey home was robbery. According to his confession, The situation changed after the family members had been restrained and the property had been taken. Gray explained that he decided the victims could not remain alive because they had seen him and Dandridge. This statement provided investigators with an explanation that matched the physical evidence already collected. A confession can be powerful evidence, but investigators must still verify that the information provided is accurate. In this case, authorities compared Gray's statements against the facts known from the crime scene. They examined whether his description matched the location of evidence, the condition of the victims, the stolen property, and the attempted fire. The consistency between his account and the independent evidence strengthened the case against him. It showed that the confession was not merely an accusation without support, but part of a larger body of evidence. Ray Dandridge's role was examined separately. Investigators determined that he participated in the robbery and remained involved throughout the crimes committed with Gray. However, the available evidence indicated that Gray was the individual who made the most important decisions, particularly the decision to kill the victims. This difference would become significant during the legal process. Prosecutors needed to establish not only what happened, but also the specific actions and level of responsibility of each defendant. As investigators continued building the case, they also examined the connection between the Harvey murders and the other crimes committed during the Richmond spree. The surviving victim from the January 3rd robbery provided information that helped authorities identify the suspects. Additional evidence from the Baskerville, Tucker family murders strengthened the conclusion that Gray and Dandridge were responsible for a series of connected crimes rather than a single isolated incident. The investigation became a process of linking separate events into one timeline. Each crime provided additional information about the offender's methods, movements, and decisions. One of the most significant conclusions from the investigation was that the Harvey family had not been specifically targeted. Detectives found no evidence that Gray or Dandridge knew Brian, Catherine, Stella, or Ruby before entering the home. There was no personal conflict, no previous relationship, and no indication of revenge or planned attack against the family. Instead, investigators determined that the offenders were searching for an opportunity to commit robbery, and the Harvey residence became that opportunity. This finding shaped both public understanding and the prosecution's presentation of the case. It explained why a family with no known enemies could suddenly become victims of such extreme violence. The randomness of the crime was one of the reasons the case affected the Richmond community so deeply. People often attempt to understand violent crimes by searching for connections between victims and offenders. A dispute, a relationship, or a previous conflict can create a sense of explanation, even if the explanation is painful. The Harvey case offered no such comfort. The victims were ordinary people living ordinary lives. Their tragedy came from an encounter with individuals whose intentions had nothing to do with who they were. For investigators, the confessions and evidence provided answers to many of the questions that had surrounded the case. They understood how the offenders entered the house, why they targeted the residents, how the family was controlled, why the murders occurred, and why the fire was set afterward. However, understanding the crime did not lessen its impact. Evidence could reconstruct events, but it could not restore the lives lost. Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, Stella Harvey, and Ruby Harvey remained the central focus of the investigation, not because they were victims in a criminal case file, but because they were a family whose future had been taken away. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they carried the responsibility of presenting the evidence in a way that honored those lives while proving the guilt of the accused. The courtroom would become the final stage where investigators' work would be tested. Every piece of evidence gathered from the damaged Harvey home, every statement from witnesses, and every admission made by the suspects would be examined publicly. The question before the court would not simply be whether a terrible crime had occurred. That fact was already undeniable. The question would be whether the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge were responsible and what punishment was appropriate for their actions. After months of investigation, Richmond was finally approaching that moment of judgment. The search for truth had uncovered the reality behind the tragedy. Now the justice system would determine how that truth would be answered. More than a decade after the events of January 1st, 2006, the Harvey family murders remain one of the most painful and unforgettable cases in the history of Richmond, Virginia. The legal proceedings eventually reached their conclusion. The men responsible were punished, and the investigation was officially closed. Yet for those who knew Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, Stella, and Ruby, the end of the court process did not represent the end of the tragedy. The impact of the crime continued through the lives of family members, friends, neighbors, investigators, and a community that was forced to confront the reality that unimaginable violence could enter even the most peaceful places. The Harvey family was remembered not because of the terrible circumstances surrounding their deaths, but because of the lives they had lived before that morning. Brian Harvey was more than a victim in a homicide investigation. He was a musician, a creative person, and a respected figure within Richmond's alternative music community. As a member of the band House of Freaks, he had built a reputation through his work in music during the 1980s and 1990s. Friends and acquaintances remembered him as someone who was passionate about his art and devoted to his family. His identity was not defined by the crime that took his life. It was defined by the years he spent creating music, building relationships, and raising his children. Catherine Harvey was similarly remembered for the warmth and positivity she brought to those around her. She worked in retail and was described by people who knew her as friendly, caring, and involved in her community. Her role as a mother was central to how many people remembered her. She was not simply a victim in a case file. She was a person who had spent years caring for her daughters and building a family life with Brian. The deaths of Stella and Ruby were especially devastating because they represented futures that would never exist. Stella, 9 years old, was still at the beginning of her childhood. Like many children her age, she had years of learning, friendships, and experiences ahead of her. Ruby, only 4 years old, was even younger, with almost her entire life still ahead. Their deaths added a particular level of sorrow to the case because the violence had not only taken away 4 people, it had destroyed the future of an entire family. The community response after the murders reflected the deep sense of loss felt throughout Richmond. Woodland Heights had been known as a quiet residential neighborhood where people felt comfortable and safe. Many residents had developed a strong sense of trust in their surroundings, with some even maintaining habits, such as leaving doors unlocked during the day. The discovery that a family had been attacked inside their own home changed that perception. The crime created fear, but it also created a powerful sense of unity. People came together to support one another and to remember the Harvey family. The investigation itself became a major event for Richmond law enforcement. Detectives faced the challenge of solving not only a family murder, but also a rapidly developing crime spree. The fact that additional victims were discovered within days increased the urgency of the investigation. Officers had to work quickly to identify the offenders before more people became victims. The eventual connection of the crimes and the arrests of Gray and Dandridge brought relief, but it also revealed the full extent of the violence that had occurred. 7 people had been killed in less than a week. The case demonstrated how a series of decisions made by 2 individuals could create devastating consequences across an entire city. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Harvey murders was the randomness of the victims' selection. People often search for reasons after a tragedy. They look for warning signs, conflicts, or explanations that might make the event easier to understand. In this case, investigators found no evidence that the Harvey family had any connection to the offenders. They were not targeted because of personal disagreements or because of something they had done. They were victims of an opportunity created by offenders looking for money and valuables. That reality made the crime particularly difficult for many people to process. The idea that an ordinary family could become the target of such violence simply because circumstances aligned in the wrong way created a lasting sense of vulnerability. The case also raised broader questions about the nature of criminal decision-making. The original motive identified by investigators was robbery. Gray and Dandridge entered the home seeking property. Yet the violence that followed far exceeded any financial gain they achieved. The stolen items were ordinary possessions, but the consequences were permanent. The case became a reminder that criminal acts are not only measured by material losses. The greatest damage was the loss of human lives and the suffering experienced by those left behind. The conviction of Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge provided a legal conclusion, but justice could never fully repair the harm caused. Gray's execution in 2017 marked the final stage of the legal process against him. Dandridge's sentence ensured that he would remain imprisoned without the possibility of parole. These outcomes answered the legal question of responsibility, but they could not answer the emotional questions faced by those who loved the victims. Court decisions can determine punishment. They cannot bring back a father, a mother, or two children. In the years following the murders, the Harvey family became a symbol of the importance of remembering victims rather than allowing their stories to become defined only by the crimes committed against them. The details of the investigation were necessary for understanding what happened, but the lasting memory of the case belongs to the people who were lost. Brian, Catherine, Stella, and Ruby represented a family with relationships, dreams, personalities, and a place within their community. They were more than names connected to a tragedy. They were individuals whose lives mattered before that morning and continued to matter afterward. The Harvey family murders also became part of Richmond's history because they marked one of the most significant criminal investigations in the city's modern era. The case demonstrated the importance of cooperation between investigators, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and community members. It showed how evidence that survives even the most deliberate attempts at destruction can eventually reveal the truth. The fire set inside the Harvey home was intended to erase the crime. Instead, the remaining evidence helped investigators uncover the events and hold the offenders accountable. Ultimately, the story of the Harvey family murders is not only about the actions of two criminals. It is about the lives interrupted, the people who searched for answers, and a community that had to rebuild after experiencing profound loss. The violence that occurred on New Year's Day, 2006, changed Richmond forever. But it did not erase the memory of those who were taken. The most important legacy of the case is not the names of the offenders or the details of the investigation. It is the reminder that behind every criminal case are real people whose lives, relationships, and memories deserve to be remembered. Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, Stella Harvey, and Ruby Harvey entered history because of a terrible act of violence. But they should ultimately be remembered for something far more important: the lives they lived before that tragedy occurred. The Harvey family murders began with an ordinary moment. A father stepping outside to collect the morning newspaper. A quiet neighborhood beginning the first day of a new year. A family home that represented comfort, safety, and the familiar routines of everyday life. Nothing about that morning suggested that it would become one of the darkest days in Richmond, Virginia's recent history. Yet within a short period of time, the lives of Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, Stella Harvey, and Ruby Harvey were taken, leaving behind a tragedy that would continue to affect their community for years. More than a decade later, the details of the case remain disturbing. But the most important part of remembering this tragedy is not the violence itself. It is remembering the people who were lost and understanding the impact their absence created. The story of the Harvey family is ultimately a story about lives interrupted, not only about the crime committed against them. Brian Harvey was known by many people through his music. As a member of House of Freaks, He had contributed to Richmond's alternative music scene and built a creative identity that extended beyond the walls of his home. To those who knew him personally, however, he was not simply a musician. He was a husband, a father, and a friend. His life was centered not only around artistic expression, but also around the family he had created. With Catherine Harvey was remembered as a warm and positive presence in the lives of those around her. Friends and community members described her as someone who cared about others and participated actively in the world around her. She represented the everyday strength found in people who quietly support their families and communities. Like Brian, her identity existed far beyond the circumstances of her death. She was a person with relationships, memories, and hopes for the future. Stella and Ruby represented the most painful loss of all. They were children whose lives had only just begun. Stella was 9 years old, an age filled with learning, imagination, and the discovery of the world around her. Ruby was 4 years old, still at the earliest stage of childhood, with countless experiences that should have awaited her. Their deaths transformed the crime from a devastating family tragedy into something that affected people far beyond those who personally knew the Harveys. Many people in Richmond struggled with the reality that 2 children could become victims of such violence. The crime challenged the basic sense of safety that communities often depend on. Homes are supposed to be places where people feel protected. Families are supposed to be able to close their doors at night and believe that inside those walls, they are safe. The Harvey murders destroyed that assumption for many residents of Woodland Heights and beyond. The fact that the family was not specifically targeted made the case even more difficult to comprehend. Investigators found no evidence that Brian or Catherine had any relationship with Ricky Gray or Ray Dandridge before the attack. There was no personal conflict that explained why the Harvey home became the scene of such a tragedy. The family became victims because the offenders were searching for an opportunity to commit robbery. This randomness created a particular kind of fear because it suggested that innocence alone could not always provide protection from violence. The investigation eventually revealed the sequence of events that led to the murders. Gray and Dandridge entered the home seeking valuables. They restrained the family, searched the residence, and took property. Afterward, Gray made the decision to eliminate the witnesses who could identify them. The attempt to burn the house was an effort to hide what had happened, but the evidence survived. Investigators were able to reconstruct the crime, connect it to the broader Richmond spree, and bring the offenders before the justice system. The case demonstrated the importance of careful investigation and the persistence required to uncover the truth. Every piece of evidence collected from the damaged residence, every statement from witnesses, and every connection between separate crimes contributed to understanding what happened. The work of investigators ensured that the Harvey family murders would not remain an unsolved tragedy. The eventual convictions of Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge provided accountability. Gray received the death penalty for the murders of Stella and Ruby Harvey and was later executed in 2017. Dandridge received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole after accepting responsibility for his role. These outcomes represented the conclusion of the criminal justice process, but they did not represent the end of the story. For the people who loved the Harvey family, justice could never mean restoration. No sentence could return Brian, Catherine, Stella, or Ruby. No courtroom decision could recreate the future that was taken from them. The lasting impact of the case can be seen in the way the Harvey family continues to be remembered. Their names remain connected to one of Richmond's most painful moments. But their memory should not be limited to the crime. They should be remembered as a family who existed before tragedy entered their lives. They should be remembered through Brian's music, Catherine's kindness, Stella's childhood, and Ruby's joy. The offenders made a choice that caused unimaginable suffering. But that choice should not define the entirety of the victims' stories. The broader lesson of the Harvey family murders extends beyond the specific events of January 1st, 2006. The case reminds us that behind every criminal investigation are real people whose lives cannot be reduced to evidence reports, courtroom arguments, or newspaper headlines. Victims are often introduced through the circumstances of their deaths, but they deserve to be understood through the circumstances of their lives. The Harvey family was not important because they became part of a famous criminal case. They were important because they were human beings who mattered to the people around them. The tragedy also serves as a reminder of the unpredictable nature of violence. A simple moment, an unlocked or partially open door, and the actions of two individuals searching for money changed the course of an entire family's history. The crime was not caused by anything the Harvey family did. Their lives were taken because others made destructive and irreversible choices. Recognizing this reality is essential when remembering victims of violent crime. As years pass, investigations conclude, trials end, and headlines fade. Communities are left with the responsibility of preserving memory. The Harvey family murders remain part of Richmond's history, but the people involved were never merely characters in a crime story. They were a father, a mother, and two daughters. They were neighbors, friends, and loved ones. They were people whose lives had meaning long before their names appeared in an investigation file. The final chapter of the Harvey family murders is therefore not about the offenders, the fire, or the courtroom. It is about remembrance. It is about acknowledging the lives that were lost and refusing to allow the brutality of the crime to overshadow the humanity of the victims. Brian Harvey, Catherine Harvey, Stella Harvey, and Ruby Harvey remain remembered not because of how they died, but because of who they were. Their story stands as a reminder that every victim of violent crime leaves behind a world that is permanently changed. And in remembering them, we honor not only the tragedy they endured, but also the lives they lived.